Welcome to this programming user interface lecture. Today we're going to do a demo of adding CSS to our class project sites. So we're going to be using the New York Times bestseller site. And so we're going to go through adding various CSS things to the site, some styling to various aspects of the page, doing some flexbox layout, and some other miscellaneous things. So this is just going to be kind of vanilla CSS, and we're not using any frameworks yet. So to get started, I'm going to remix the New York Times glitch site, pui-nyt.glitch.me. I'm going to remix it. And we're going to start off, adding CSS to each one of the pages. Depending on the page type, changing which parts we're going to do. We're probably going to add CSS, some modifications to the header to make the header the same on all pages. And then we might even look at doing some more other advancing, like web fonts and stuff like that. All right, so again, to review this New York Times bestseller project page, we have the book page, the home page, and the advanced search, or kind of like search page. And so what we're going to do is start off with the home page. So I think in the HTML version of it, we added some consistent headers throughout the site. So we'll continue doing that. So we had an unordered list with a list element, and there was a link to the home page here, and then we had the same thing, but a link to the search page. So this would be the home, and this would be advanced search. Right, so pretty simple. If we look at this in the browser, we'll see that it is a list, right? How we would expect a list to show up. Let's wrap this in the nav tag. So, of course, right, we probably wouldn't want the menu to be kind of like a list unless it was responsive. But today we're just doing some basic non-responsive CSS. So we will want to make these list items flow horizontally, right, instead of vertically. So if we look at how we would do that, we could have three options, right? We could put a style tag here, put our style there. We could change the style attribute, inline style, or we could do the external style sheet, which already is included here under style.css. And so what's nice about doing it in the external style sheet for this particular page is that we're going to have the header on three pages, right? The home page, the book page, and the search page. So if we do this external style sheet, we could set the CSS styles just once on that home page, or on the external style sheet, and then include it on the home page, on the book page, and on the search page. So in this case, it's usually better to do the external style sheet for your styles. And so here we have our style sheet. It's empty so far. And so the first thing we want to do is, when we're thinking about writing one of these styles, a CSS style for something like this, is we want to think about how to write the correct CSS selector to get exactly to the pieces that we want to modify, right? And so we want to change the way these list items behave in the nav and unordered list. So what I always like to do is, before I start writing the CSS rules, is that you can actually use the developer tools to play around with the CSS styles of something, and then you can kind of get a kind of a hint of what you want to change or what attributes you would change. So if we inspect this, you can see that the A-link has a display type of list item, and the UL has a display type of block, and it also has list style type as a disk. And so if we think about what we'd want to change, is we'd want to get rid of this disk, right? So we don't want to have this little circle, and we want the items to flow horizontally and not vertically. And maybe we want to change the font size and maybe add a background color or something like that, just to make it very obvious they're nav buttons or nav links. So basically we'd want to do a couple things here, right? We want to change this from display block, we want to change this display from list item, so we can overwrite this in the browser, right, just to see how it would behave in real time. And we'll say we want to display inline block, and we change that for the other one too, display inline block. Oops, that was for the A-link. We want to change it for the list item, display inline block. Right, so now that we changed the way that these list items behave, they now flow. They're not displaying as a block, they're displaying as an inline block. So they're not creating a new line or a new block for themselves, and they flow across like this, right? So that's a little bit better. And the way we also when doing that, we also kind of disabled this list type selector, but we could also do that by saying list style type none. We want to be thorough, right? And so to get this initial kind of style, all we need to do is say, okay, I want to find all the list items that live in a nav element and make their display type to inline block. And so this is just in the browser, right? So if we refreshed, it would go back to what it was, its default. So now we need to go to our CSS style sheet and add that rule in, right? And so we can select everything that has a child of something by kind of doing that space and then selecting the next element that you want to select. So we can say nav. So we know we want the nav element and then the li elements in the nav element, right? So we're selecting all the nav, all the list elements in a nav. And we'll say display is inline block. So if we save this, it saves it and we refresh it automatically. So now it's applying that CSS style to the things that we want, right?
So if we had bunch of other list elements here, let's make another list and add some list elements. If we had these and we looked at the site again, we'd see that they were unaffected by the rule, right? Because the rule is only selecting the specific list items when they're in a nav element, when they're the children of a nav element. Okay, so let's go on and style this some more. We'll remove those. And like I said earlier, it's nice to be able to just inspect an element and edit the style in the browser. So kind of getting it just how you would want it to look. And so let's style the A-link here. So let's get rid of the text underline that's in decoration, none. Let's make the color always be black for the text. Let's give it a background color. My favorite color, tomato. Let's give it a rounded kind of edges with border radius. Let's do 0.5 EM. We can make it a little bit more space by giving it some padding, say 0.1 EM. Yeah, and so once you have it in a place you like it, you can copy the text, the styles just from the browser editor, and you can just go over to your style sheet, and we are working on the we're working on the nav element still, but the A link's inside the nav. So we can go in here and just say nav A links and paste. And then we'll just copy over the styles we made in the browser. And so if we look, all right, great. So we could even add like a pseudo class to this, right? So we could say on hover, I would like you to change the background color to white. And so when you hover over it, it turns the white. And so you could even say, and add a border that is solid, 1 pixel wide, and tomato. And so this is an example of kind of compressing the CSS styles into one line, this one border property. So this is the equivalent of saying border hyphen style is solid, border style hyphen width is 1 pixel, and border color is tomato. Right, and tomato is a reserved word in CSS land that represents a certain color. You could also make the color by doing a hexadecimal number, right? So this is white, this is black, and then there's all a whole huge range in between. You can also do RGB and then do the red, green, blue. And you can even do RGBA, and then the fourth parameter is the opacity of the color. So we're going to stick with tomato. And so these three rules kind of just are the same rule but broken out into more verbose individual properties. So whichever way you feel comfortable doing, if you're more comfortable just kind of smushing them all into one abbreviated property, or if you want to be like very explicit in the property values, you can list them out like that. All right, so now when they hover, they get this nice animation there. And you could also say, okay, I see like a little bit of a weird offsetting here happening right when I hover. It's because it's adding a border and there wasn't a border before. So you could just add a white border to the original one. So it's always a white border. So when they hover over it, it doesn't do that kind of offset animation. And then let's say finally, if we inspect this, we can see that this unordered list element has a padding of 40 pixels by default. That's a browser style. That green piece up here next to the home is the padding. And so we might want that, but for now, let's turn that off. So we can say nav unordered list should have a padding of 0. And when you say 0, I don't mean 0 pixels. I don't mean 0 EMs. 0 just means nothing, no padding. You can use that for any property that accepts a numerical unit. All right, so then we have a different looking menu, list items. Okay, so the next thing we could do is start styling the homepage even more. So we know that there's like up to the possibility, we have this feature where we can have 3 random books displayed on the homepage for each reload. And those just are stored as 3 different variables for each piece of the metadata. So what we could do is say, let's have a just a display of 3 book covers and the title, right, on the homepage. And so that's good. We're going to kind of need like a 3-column layout to have each book cover and name. So let's do that with Flexbox. We can add a 3-column layout pretty simply with Flexbox. So let's look at the code here. So in our main thing, we're going to have since Flexbox needs a container, we'll make a container. We need to give it a class so that we can reference it later. So we'll say random book container. So that's going to be the parent, and then we'll have 3 items underneath of it. We'll have div that has the class of random book. That'll be book 1, be book 2, and book 3. And so if we take a look at this now, right, this is how you would expect it to work because it's just divs being stacked on top of each other. So we want to turn this into a flexbox display mode. So we go and take our classes that we defined here, random book container, and we'll say, okay, random book container is a display type flex. And random book class, which are the children, are going to be flex 1, right? Because we want them to be equal for each individual column. So if we take a look at that, we can see now we have book 1, book 2, and book 3. Okay, so we have some initial layout here, right? This looks good. It has our 3 books, our 3 random books. There's a place for them to live on the home page. So what we need to do right now is start adding content, right? So probably want to add the title for each one. And since there's 3 different variables for each random book, so we have title 2, and title 3. So let's see if that worked. Yep, there's a title. There's 1 title, 2 title, title series. We probably want to make these things centered, right, in their item. So we can go into the style, and this is the item, right? And we'll say text align center. So we'll center everything. So now that everything's centered, that's a little nicer. And then we will add, say, like an image to it, right? So we have the book cover images, we know we do. Let's start under cover. So we could come in here and say image source equals cover, and then cover 2, and then cover 3, right? So let's see how this looks. Looks pretty wild, right? Big Jimmy Carter. And so what the problem is that these images are taking up as much as they possibly can, right? So what we could do is go in here and say, like, okay, images in random book should be a certain size, right? So we can go into style and say random book images need to be have a width of 75% of its container, so 75% of its parent. Okay, it looks pretty good, right? And it's still centered. We can go in here and delete these extra pieces of data. But first we want to make it clickable, right? So right now you can't click through to the book. So we're going to go in here and see how this is structured, how it's using this ISBN number to kind of build a URL in this href attribute. So it goes /book/ the ISBN number, and that's like the permanent link to that book. And so what we can do is we can just borrow that, right, and make it wrap the entire set of stuff. All right, and of course we got to do this to 3 and 2, and that's 1. All right, so now these are clickable, right? So now you could click on this and it would take you to that permanent book link. There's a debate about whether this is a good thing to do or not, but you could always say target equals blank, and that forces the browser to open that link in a new tab. I'm not saying you'd want to do that for this, probably wouldn't, but if you wanted that functionality or that That's how you do it with A links. So then we want to get rid of all this stuff at the bottom, right? So we'll clean that up. And refresh, refresh, refresh. Let's make these not look like normal links because they're kind of like image links. So let's borrow that text decoration none. Color black. And so if we keep looking here, we notice we kind of have a little bit of a problem depending on how styled you want your site to be, right? So we can see that this book cover is a little bit longer than this one, which is a little bit longer than this one. And so the problem is here that the images are different, right? So if you had consistent images for all of your assets, they are all the same size, then you'd be set, right? You'd never have to worry about this. But the majority of the time, you're going to have images that are not necessarily uniform all the time, right? Images can be whatever aspect ratio that they want to be. And we are pretty lucky for most of the time because books usually have a pretty consistent, they're taller than they are wide, and they are usually around the same size. But as we saw, like in this one, this looks pretty a little bit messy, right? So, of course, there's ways to fix this, and so we could try one thing where we could say, okay, I want to make all the items in this flex box align to the bottom. So you could say flex align content to be, or align items to be end or start. And so that would change the way the items kind of start off at. So in this case, if we'd say align items end, then at least they'd kind of be at the bottom, but it still doesn't look very good, I would say. And so now you're into this problem of, okay, so you want to make these images consistently displayed across regardless of their actual inherent dimensions. And so to do that, we kind of have to do something more complicated and switch from just displaying images as a IMG element to actually display it as a div with an image as the background. And so that's kind of that doesn't really make sense. It's not really, why would you use a div to display an image, right? That seems anti-semantic HTML. And so the reason is because just the way that the standard is developed and the way browsers have implemented things, if you have a div, you can actually set the background of it to be whatever you want, and whatever you want could be an image. So you can imagine you could have a div, and then the background would be like wallpaper, and the wallpaper would be just happen to be the book cover. And you do that because when you're applying that background using CSS, you can do all sorts of manipulations and have the browser try to display it differently. And so if we switch over to that mindset of how we're going to display these book covers, we're going to have to think about, okay, we're going to want a div that's always a certain same size for all three, and then use CSS to apply this book cover as like a wallpaper, right? So let's get started doing that. So I'm going to come in here back to the home page and get rid of our image tag, right? Gone. And in place of that, I'm going to put a div, and I'm going to call this div, give it a class of homepage book cover, right? And so now I'm going to put that div in all three of the places, right? So I'm going to go back to my style sheet here and style up this homepage book cover class. And we're going to say, 75% looked pretty good before. So we're going to say, okay, it's going to have to be width 75%. Divs inherently have 0 height, right? Because if they don't have any content in them, then they take up the size of their content, and no content means no size, so it's 0 width or 0 height, 100% width by default, but 0 height by default. So we have to tell it how tall it should be. So we'll say this can be a pixel, right? Because these are images, that's fine. We'll say 250 pixels tall. And let's just give it a background color of blue for now, just so we can visualize it. All right, so these are where our background cover should be, right? So we'd want to fill in this with a background image. And so one thing we'll notice first that they're not centered, right? That's not going to work for us. So if we go into here, here's our book cover. We'd want to make them centered. And so with a div, you can say, give it a margin of auto. And since it's a block element, if you give it a margin of auto, it will try to give it a same margin on both sides of it. And so that will give it a margin of equal between the two, left and right. And so then you have a equally spaced div. All right, so now we have where they're going to live, right? Where the images are going to live for the book covers. The last thing we actually need to do is put the book covers in there. And so let's get a book cover image. We know that they're stored in this variable called cover. So here's one. See how it looks. Okay. I just needed to get a URL. I don't have one memorized or anything. All right. So what we can do is, I'm just going to do this in the browser so we can play around with the style of it. And so what we can do is we can say background, and it has all these background properties, right? And one of them is background image. And so when you're doing a CSS background image, you have a couple of options. Normally, you're going to give it a URL to the image, right? And we have a URL to the image. You could also do a thing where you actually encode the image as base64 encoding, which is just like it turns the binary data into this textual data. You could actually embed that here, but we're not going to do that because these images could be fairly large, so that would be, and we don't have them as base64, we have them as URLs. So to do a URL in CSS, you say URL, and then inside the parentheses is the URL. Okay, so it worked kind of, right? So basically the div is like, I'm a div, give me that image as my wallpaper, and then the wallpaper is very large, bigger than 250 pixels, so it just shows you the top corner of it. So what's nice about this thing, the CSS properties for the background image, and the reason we're doing this, we're treating a div as an image, is because then we can say background size. And background size has a few properties that you can do. One of them is contain. So it will try to wholly contain the entire image within the dimensions of the div. And then another one is cover. So basically it will try its best to fill the entire div with the content of the image, right? And so if you think about that, it's kind of a complicated algorithm to do that, right? Because you have two different size things and it's trying its best to distort it so that it fits it, or crop it so that it fits it correctly. And so if we think about, if you have different sizes images, you'd want to use this cover algorithm to kind of crop it to the right positions for each div. So we're going to use cover, and then we want to do it for the other two, right? And so the problem we have here is that this one can definitely go into our style sheet, right? This can live in our style sheet. Let's put it in there now. But if we think about, oh, we lost it. If we think about the image, the background image and the URL, that's unique for each page, right? That's unique for each item. You can't put that in the style sheet, right? Because if you put this in the style sheet, oops, let me grab the image again. If you put this in the style sheet, it's going to be the same one for every book every time it's displayed, right? Which is not what we want, right? So what we can do is we know that this does not belong in the style sheet, right? So we need to take it out of the style sheet. And so we can think about, okay, if it's not going to live in the style sheet, then that must mean it's going to live in the element itself, right? So we can go back here and have it actually be a style attribute, right? It's an inline style. And so now when this element is, or this div is loaded and it's displayed, we know it knows exactly what cover URL it should be using, right? So the only thing we need to do is slot in our cover variable here. So if we take that and apply it to the rest of them, 1 or 2 and 3, we can see it's going to correctly generate the right URL for the right div on each page load, right? And we could get rid of that that blue, so it doesn't flash that blue every time it loads. So let's see if we can find some examples where this might be a problem. So, I mean, if you look at this, what is this? We have a hanging bracket here. Is that always there? Yes, it's always there. So let's look at that. We have an extra bracket hiding in there. So we want to go into our code here and figure out where we have an extra bracket. Oh, I added too many brackets here. All right. That's kind of interesting because like the browser didn't care too much, right? It was like, I'll try my best, and I think I know what you mean, and it'll try its best to render it. So let's take a look at the result here to see if we have any obvious problems or any ones that are not really working. And you'll notice for some of them, right, you'll see some cropping going on, right? And so this cropping is a result of the algorithm, like trying to cover the image within the rectangle, right? So if you have an arbitrary rectangle and you try to fit another arbitrary rectangle image into it, it's not going to always work. So it kind of crops stuff off sometimes. I'm trying to find an egregious example of that somewhere here. But this is a good sign, right? Mostly it looks pretty good. Lots of manga on the bestseller list, apparently. So this is kind of example, right? So if you look at this image, you'd see, oops, if you look at this image, you open it up in a new browser. You see the benediction, the ON is there, but when it's in our display, it's kind of cropped a little bit. So that's the kind of the the price you pay for having the algorithm try to fit that image into there. But I think it looks pretty good. You probably want to come in here and do some more styling, I'm sure, like make this a little bit nicer. You could do like hover effects, you could do all sorts of stuff. So you probably want to add like a, a little title here or something. Maybe you'd want to style that so it's centered. You could spend endless times working on this, right? Making it a little bit better, maybe adding some more things when this is too long, adding more padding to the bottom, all sorts of stuff, right? But this should get you started in styling the home page. All right, so let's move on and style one of the other pages. So here, let's take a look at the advanced search page that we made here. And I just want to copy over the header so that's consistent. And the advanced search page, right, is like page that has the search results. So when you search for something, a bunch of results come back, right? So let's style this a little bit. So we'd probably want to style the forms, right? If you wanted this to look a little different, you could style the buttons, all sorts of stuff, right? So if we look at the style for buttons, right? So you can make all the buttons on your site consistent to a certain style or a certain kind of look, which could be however you want. So we could say border radius 1 EM or 0.5 EM, background color white, font weight bold. So we have styled the button here. We could style the form inputs here, right? So this is a select and this is a text input. So if we wanted to, we could change the default behavior for select and inputs to be a certain way, right? And so here I'm using the comma delimiter to say I want both of these things to be affected by the same CSS rule. And let's do our favorite border radius 0.5 EM. So it should say, okay, these two things now should be styled the same, right? And so we have a nice little border radius there. So of course, you spend a lot of time developing what your inputs would look like, but that would get you started. So the only other thing, it's a pretty big thing, but the other thing on this page is the search results, right? So when you put a text in here, it does the search and returns results based on the search. And so it's similar to the home page, right? We have a bunch of metadata being displayed for each item that had a search result in it. So what we can do is think about how we'd want this to look and then use CSS to style it. So we probably want something similar as the home page where we have like the book cover and then maybe the metadata to the right of it. So if we think about that, it's going to be like a 2-column layout. So there's going to be a book cover and then the other div would be the container for the metadata. So we could do something like this, right? And so remember we talked about this earlier, how this is kind of like a loop. It's a loop function. It's a for each loop. And so it's saying for each one of the results, put one of the results into the variable R, and then for how many number of results, just repeat this HTML. And for each repetition, R is going to be a different piece of the result set. And so this block of HTML is repeated as many number of times as there are books in the results, and each one of these r.title is a different title for each result, right? So knowing that, we kind of can say like, okay, well, this is the metadata part of it. And so if we think about our flex layout, we need to have a parent, right, container, and then we're going to have two children, one for the book cover and one for the metadata. So we have our metadata here, so we can just drop that into the second div, and that will be our metadata to get started. And then we have our book cover here, and then we see to give these classes so we can style them, right? So this class will be, I'll say search results container. Okay, and we'll call this class equals search results. Search results, and this will be search results metadata, and this will be search results book cover. All right, so we have these classes defined, right? And so if we can start kind of thinking about reusing CSS, so that's the kind of the power of CSS is you would always want to be thinking about how can you write this rule that affects exactly what I want it to affect, but then you know, don't have to write a style for each individual thing, right? Maybe you can start reusing stuff. So if we go back to our home page, we kind of already did this with the random book container, right? So that is just this display flex. So we could say, okay, let's also add in this search results container. So we don't need to make a new class or a new definition rule set for that one because it's basically exactly the same as the other one, right? And so you might even be a little bit smarter and like combine these two into something like flex container, right? And then you would use that same one class in both places if you wanted to be a little bit more elegant. So we're not going to do that though. We're just going to kind of be very explicit about what our classes are. So we took care of that one. And then our other class that we have defined are going to be the search results book cover. And the search results metadata. And so if you think about how we want this to work, we'll say the book cover should be flex1 and the metadata should be twice as big as the other siblings, so twice as large as the book cover. All right, so if we take a look at how that looks on the search page. So this is just kind of a little quirk of glitch and how it works is that it, you know, it automatically refreshes it and it automatically updates it when you make a change. And so you could go into here and do the show on the side, and then it would always, and you could set the URL to be permanently at the page you want to edit, and that would work fine. For me, I have this smaller screen and I'm kind of enlarging everything. So I'm just going to make a new tab and have that result page pre-populated with that URL. And I'm just gonna have to like refresh it every time I make a change because Glitch is not automatically refreshing this one tab for me. But if we look here, so we have our book cover here, and then we have our metadata here, book cover metadata. And each one of them is about it's twice as big as the book cover, right? So if you were resizing this, it would still try to stay twice as big. All right, so it's kind of, we can kind of reuse a lot of stuff we've already done, right? So we know that if we have a very kind of, we went through a lot of work to get the book covers being displayed the way we want them. So let's just reuse what we did on the home page, right? So if we go back to the index and we find our home page book cover, we can just reuse that. Make sure we have the whole div though. And so let's go to our search results and we'll plop that in there. So again, so you probably want to go back and change the name of the style to represent not just as a homepage anymore, right? So you have to change it in every place. So let's just do that just as an example. So right now I have it defined as homepage book cover. So I'm just going to change it to book cover. So now this is a kind of a more generalized style class. And so I just need to come in here and change homepage book cover to book cover. And I need to change it back on the homepage too. And Glitch has, it's similar to text editors. If you do Control D, it will highlight all the same strings at once. You can just copy paste and replace all of them at once. All right, so now I have this kind of a little bit more reusable class here. And the only other thing to do is change the variable, right? And so in this loop, it's looping. It's still there's still a cover for each one, but it's not called a cover. It's called r.cover because each result is its own iteration of the loop and it's stored in R. Okay, so we did a lot of changes there, so hopefully this works. Let's refresh. Okay, so there's book cover. Let's get rid of the word book cover. It's also good to check and make sure the homepage works still, right? The book covers are still there. Okay. All right, so now we have the book cover being displayed on the left. And let's style the metadata, right? And so, you'd have to think about how you want to do this. One good way of elements of displaying serialized kind of list of metadata is the DD, DT, HTML elements. So let's look at Mozilla. So you have a DL element, and then you have a DT, which represents in our case, it represents the type of metadata it is, and then the DD would represent the actual value itself, right? So this seems like a good enough HTML layout for us, right? And so you could do anything you wanted here, really. It's up to you. Of course, you'd probably want the title to be slightly different, right? Because that's kind of like the main piece of data, right? So this, you might want this to be, you might add a class here to be like metadata title, and then maybe in our style sheet we'd have a metadata title, and we'll make that into something like font weight bold, and we'll make it slightly larger, so we'll say font size 1.25 EM. So now we have the title is a little bit of a pop out, right? Pops out a little bit more. And then we'll go in and we'll style a few of these pieces of metadata. So we did the title already. You probably also want to come in here and add, in the template lecture, we talked about checking if things were actually there or not, right, with if statements. So you could add an if statement to check to make sure that there's actually an ISBN. So you'd say if r.isbn.length is greater than 0, then do this HTML inside of here and then close the bracket. Right, so this is like an if statement that it checks the value of something and only does it if it's true. And so in this case, it would only display the ISBN if the ISBN length is greater than 0. So if there is an ISBN, it would display it. So some of these don't have ISBNs, of course, for whatever reasons. It's not in the data. Most of them probably would, though. All right, and so if we're going to get into our way we're going to style these, right? We were talking about using the DL and DT and DD elements. So this whole thing would be a DL list, right? And then the DT would be the title of the piece of metadata. So we would say change this to DT, and we would say ISBN. And then this wouldn't be a div anymore, it'd be a DD. And so we can see how that looks here. Refresh. So here we have ISBN, and then we have kind of like a indentation, and then we have the value there. So we could do that for all of these, right? So let's just kind of go through each one and change the value that we're checking and change the description. All right, so that one's done. Let's test it out. There's the description. Do the next one. It's creator. The next one is OCLC number. So the OCLC number, this is kind of, if you're into books, it's just like a, OCLC is like a aggregator in the library world. And so they have a database called WorldCat that contains pretty much most books and libraries. And so if it has an OCLC number, then it can link out to the WorldCat page. So this would be a way for someone to find it in their library. So that might be cool, right? So we could, if you format, if you go to WorldCat/OCLC and then the number, let's see if we can get a number here. I think this is, I don't know yet, which is a number. So let's save this and refresh. All right, so here's a number. If we put that into the worldcat.org/oclc./number, it would jump to that book page, and then you could find it in a library near you. So that's kind of cool. So let's make sure, instead of just displaying this dumb number that makes no sense to anyone, we could say something like, find it in your library, right? And then change this from just being a display of the data to actually being an A link, right? And we'll say href equals https www.worldcat.org/oclc/ and then it would slot in the variable there. And then we close it and have a close A link, and we'll say find or something like that. You probably would have a better call to action there. But here it says find in your library, and then there's a link here. This probably would be an example where we'd want to have like a target equals blank to open up in a new window. So if you click on find, someone can link out and jump to read Game of Thrones in their local library. Okay, so if we keep going, we can add this other pieces of data in really quickly as similar formats. I mean, you probably want to evaluate each piece of data, right? And be like, do I want to display it in this way? Is this a good way to display this piece of data? That's why, you know, something like this is not arbitrary. It's a long process. But for us, we can just quickly come in here and fill in this information. So many questions, right? Do I add colons at the end of the labels? All this stuff, right? Lots of style decisions to make. So the subjects are slightly different, and so one of the things we kind of talked about in one of our recent classes was that this if statement was not working for subjects. When there was 0 subjects, this check was not working, and we talked a little bit about it, and we figured out that it has to be greater than 0 is not working, it has to be greater than 1. And so thinking back on it, if kind of just why is that the case for this certain field? And so the way that this field is stored in the database is and this is just an explanation for if you're curious from our previous discussion. So the way it's stored in the database is there's a subject 1, subject 2, subject 3, right? So this is how it's stored in the database. It's stored as a string, a big string separated by commas. And so when it's served in the template, it splits this on the comma. So then this becomes subject 1, subject 2, sorry, subject 3. You get it, right? So it turns the string into this array of 3 things. And so the problem is with the system, just the way it's made, is that when there's no subject, it's a blank string. And when it splits a blank string, it splits it into this. So there is actually one thing in the array, and it's a blank string. And so when you're testing the length of a array, you're testing it, how many things are in that array, as opposed to testing the length of a string. You're saying how long is the string. And so you're saying, okay, how long is this array? And it's saying, there's one thing in here and it's a blank string. That's just the reason why we're going to be testing for length greater than 1 as opposed to length greater than 0. And that's just a kind of a quirkiness of this implementation of this database. All right, so we're going to test if there is actually more than one thing. So there's actually are subjects. And then we're going to loop through each one of those. And so here's a little different, right? Because we're going to have our DT is going to live here. That's the title. So say subjects. And then each one of our subjects is going to be the DD, right? So there's going to be many DDs for potentially, depending on how many subjects there are. So let's refresh. Right, so there's subjects and there's all the subjects. Probably don't need the word subject there anymore. So we'll just display the actual subject. Okay, and so a few more things left here. Let's just be completionists and do this. So publisher. And then review. And you'd have to like actually find some examples of where this is populated, the review, because I think it's like a review link. So you probably want to not just display it as a text, but maybe turn that into a link out to the review. And then this last piece is kind of like, we mentioned this earlier, it's like it's a blob of JSON. So JSON's a data serialization format, and it's a data representing its position, the book's position on the bestseller week per week, and its position, its rank. And so we would use that for like maybe doing like a D3 graph or something like that. So we don't have a lot of use for it now, but we'll save it for later. So we'll just comment this out to be used later. So if we look at this now, we can see it is a little bit better. You probably want to do stuff like come in here and say, I want, should be tabbed over. I'd want, oh, okay. So here I defined, oh, there's the title. Okay, so that makes sense. Sorry, I was a little confused. All right, so you probably want to come in here and you can make this a little bit nicer, right? So you could come in here and say, for all of the DTs that live underneath of the metadata field, probably make them maybe a little bit lighter, right? And so you could say, well, how light should it be? You can inspect this here and play around with the color, right? You can start off with gray. And so the idea is like you'd want to make the data pop more than the titles, right? Because the titles repeat. So there's a lot of, you'd have to play around with it and see what best works. So there's a lot of work. You probably want to add some padding to these two so they're spaced differently. But that's pretty much a good start to the search result page. And you probably want to add like a separator, right? Like a separator for each one, right? Because they kind of blur together. So you might want to do a kind of even odd thing. So you can actually, there's a pseudo class for just that purpose. So there's a CSS pseudo class for odd and even. And so you can use these pseudo classes to make certain children of a parent, if it's odd or even, a different style, right? And so this is nice to do things like striping rows, right? So if we look at the result here, we'd want to make like every even book or odd book background a little bit different color, right? And so if we look how it's structured, so the parent is going to be so this is the search results container. And so if we look at how the page is actually structured, we can see that the search results container, there's many search results container, right? So there's a whole bunch of them. So these would be like, in this case, the things we want to change the background color of, if they're odd or even. So to do that, we need to give to have it a parent, right? So we need to come in here and change the main to have its own class, right? So we could say something like search results. And so that would be the main parent for all these search results containers. And then we could probably come in here and say, okay, search results, and let's check out this, how they did it here. We would say nth child odd should have background color of white smoke. White smoke is just a very light gray. So let's see if this worked. Did not work. So we would have to say, so let's say instead of doing that, we'd say search results container. So we have a parent class, but maybe we don't need a parent class, we just need the container. So let's say search results container, nth child, background color should be white smoke. Let's see what that does. Yeah, okay. All right, so a little confusing there. But so basically, we didn't need a parent to say the nth child of the parent. We just need to say, okay, find all of the search result containers and then make the odd ones of them have the style apply to them. And so it gives it a little bit of nice of a distinction between it, right? You'd want to add some more padding, stuff like that. But yeah, so using pseudo classes and structuring things and formatting things a little bit better, we have a pretty decent looking search page. The last page that we maybe would want to style, right, would be the book page, right? So the book page is the individual book itself. And so when you land on the book page, it looks like this, and it basically has the metadata and just the metadata for that book. So if we think about what this would look like, it would be pretty much identical to the search result page, it would just be a little bit different, maybe larger for just one individual book. So I don't think we need to spend a lot of time redoing what we just did on the search page for the book page. But one other thing we could do, there's a whole lot to CSS, and so there's things like fonts, right? So say we wanted to use a web font on this, that's a CSS thing. And so what we could do, let's just quickly go through and add our own web font to this page if you want to. So you actually have to be in possession of a web font to apply it to your page and make it work. So Google has a nice supply of web fonts that are free under fonts.google.com. And so you could come in here and pick a font or multiple fonts based on the style of your page if you wanted to. And so let's find one. Sort by most popular, right? Let's be super tag-alongs here and use a very popular font. So let's use Roboto. It's their kind of like sans serif. I think it's used in Android and stuff like that. So if we really like this font and we wanted to use it, we just need to include it in our page somehow, right? So if we want to use this font, we could go through and we need to, I'm having a crisis here trying to add it to my font library. So when you click download, it just downloads the font file to your desktop. And so there's two ways of doing this, right? So you could either have the font file downloaded as an actual file, and if you open that, it's basically a bunch of true type font files, and you would include it. They also offer a way to include the font as like a web font that you just include via CDN. So CDN is like a content distribution network, and so you can actually, Google will host the font for you, and you can just reuse their hosting. And so if we add, so basically you'd have to decide like which one of these style would you want, right? Do you need bold italic? Do you need all of these, right? So if you pick a few, then you can embed these fonts. And so basically it would give you a little link, right? A little style sheet link that you can then put on your own page, something like that. And so of course this would need to go into the header of the page. So you'd have to include this on each header. And so you'd want to include it before your first style sheet because you might want to use those fonts in your style sheet. And then it gives you an example of how to invoke it, right? So you'd say you'd use the font family Roboto, and that would use that font on your page. And so if this, as long as this is included in my above the style sheet, external style sheet, I could go into my style sheet and say, okay, for the body, I want to use this font family that I just embedded. And so if we refreshed, we should see that it's now using this web font based on including it in from their content distribution. So the other way you do it is you have to download that zip file, put all those font files up on your server, up on the Glitch server, and then reference them. So it's nice to use, just if you want to quickly use a different font, you can use their web fonts. You are of course dependent on Google serving that font now, and of course it could go down at some point in the future. But what's nice about this font family definition is that you can basically specify the order of operations of fonts you want to use on your page, right? And so it will try to use this Roboto font first, and if it is able to, it will do that. But if it's not able to, then it will just default to a system-based sans serif. So whatever sans serif is most common on that system, or the default sans serif font will be used. So that's one example of kind of doing something a little bit more unique with CSS fonts. So there's a lot more you could do, right? And spend a lot of time making the site look just how you want it. But this should be kind of a good jumping off point to figuring out how to do some basic CSS styling for your site. All right, I'll talk to you later. Thanks. Bye.